Hey everybody, let's talk Portuguese. In today's video, we're going to be talking about Angola and the Portuguese spoken in it. Beyond just Angolan Portuguese, I want to take a deeper look into Angola, the country itself, so that we can understand why some of the aspects of Angolan Portuguese are the way they are. You can think of this video as a follow-up to the video that I did about Portuguese spoken in Africa, where I talked about all of the African nations that speak Portuguese and gave a little bit of a summary of each one of them and how that came to be. But in today's video, we're going to be focusing on Angola, which is the largest Portuguese-speaking nation in Africa. In any case, definitely go watch the video that I did about Portuguese in Africa at large. And now, let's get on to the video. So in order to understand Angolan Portuguese and its particularities, we first have to take a look at Angola and understand the country itself in a little bit better detail. Angola is the largest Portuguese-speaking African nation, both in terms of the population of the country as well as its landmass. To give you a reference of how very large Angola is not that much smaller than Alaska, or if you want to put it in smaller terms, it's about twice the size of Texas or France. Population-wise, nowadays, Angola has a little over 30 million people, but at the time of the 2014 census that was done, it had about 25 million people. For that census, 71% of the Angolan population claimed to speak Portuguese at home, whether that be as native speakers or as second language speakers who adopted Portuguese as their home language. Other studies outside of that census indicate that about half to two-thirds of those speakers are native speakers of Portuguese, that is, people who have acquired Portuguese as a native language. We will get into the status of Portuguese in just a little bit, but before we get there, I want to talk a little bit more about Angola, the country. Aside from being a geographically large and largely populated country, Angola is also home to a wide variety of ethnicities and linguistic groups. This was, of course, always the case even prior to European colonization under what would then become established as Angola later on. Angola, as the Angola that we know now as the large territorial unit, did not really come into being until the late 1800s. The Portuguese were responsible for the foundation of the two main cities in Angola, that is Luanda, the capital and largest city in the country, and Benguela, the country's second city. These two cities were founded in the 1500s by the Portuguese and were their main ports in Africa for quite some time. This coincided with all forms of trade that the Portuguese had around the world, including and importantly the slave trade, which had a large base off of the west coast of Africa. But for a few centuries, the Portuguese did not really have a vested interest in capturing more territory outside of the coastal cities that they had established. Portuguese expansion inward into the countryside of what is now known as Angola would not happen until much later on in the latter half of the 1800s. This was part of a joint political action undertaken by several European nations known as the Scramble for Africa, under which they divided Africa into territorial possessions among them. The point of this was to create spheres of influence and direct colonial control over the continent of Africa. And it is from this scramble for Africa that we have European lingua francas in Africa. The reason why English or French are so important in so many African nations is because of this colonial history. But Portugal had its interests in Africa as well, not least of which being Angola and Mozambique, which were originally supposed to be connected all the way across the continent. The British had other ideas, and so Angola and Mozambique remained separate. But this expansion inland is what ultimately gave us the modern borders of the Angolan state as we know them today. Angola was administered as a Portuguese overseas territory until 1975, when it gained independence. The independence of Angola coincided with the independence of most other Portuguese overseas territories. However, we can see from this that the colonial development of Angola by the Portuguese was markedly different from that of, say, Brazil. Whereas Brazil had quite a large colonial settlement project, including the inland of Brazil, Angola didn't really have that until the 1900s. Also, at no point were European settlers really the majority in any of the regions in Angola that they went to. The overwhelming majority of the population of Angola has always been native Africans, and European settlers really formed the administrative unit units of the territory, as well as a small minority of people who mostly lived in cities and didn't really live in the countryside. So from the get-go, we really see that Angola is split into two different Angolas. We have urban Angola in the cities of Luanda and Benguela and other cities, and then we have rural Angola, which is outside of the cities and usually further from the coast. This division will prove to be important later on. Now, I mentioned that Angola has a bunch of different ethnicities and linguistic groups. The modern state of Angola has Portuguese as its only official language. This means that Portuguese is the language of administration, schooling, and other official functions. However, there is some more limited legal recognition of the native African languages in Angola. Also, the incorporation of native African languages into things like education has been fairly limited in the country, although marked as a priority in certain aspects of development. This has led to a situation in which Angola is the African country with the most significant Portuguese consolidation among them. There are countries such as São Tomé and Príncipe which have a higher percentage of speakers than Angola, but because their population is so much lower, they are somewhat less significant. Angola is also significantly further along with the consolidation of Portuguese as a national language than Mozambique, which is the second largest Portuguese-speaking African nation. The most widely used native African languages in Angola are Umbundu, Kimbundu, and Kikongo in that order. Now, all of the native African languages in Angola are tied to specific regions. So the language of the Luanda region is Kimbundu, further to the south it is Umbundu, and so on. The other major native African languages in Angola are therefore tied to specific regions. However, those three languages have a significantly higher proportion of speakers than the other significant languages that come thereafter. And the regional status of these languages is important because it clues us into how the Portuguese language itself has developed in Angola over time. Prior to the 20th century, or basically living memory, Kimbundu was in fact the lingua franca of the Luanda region. What this means is that although Luanda has always been the most significant city in Angola, which has come to be home to many different ethnic groups, all intermingling, all with their own different languages, the lingua franca among all of those different linguistic groups was not actually Portuguese until the very end of colonization. Instead, the native language of the Luanda region, Kimbundu, was the lingua franca. That is the language that all of these different linguistic groups would converge on, including nativized Afro-Portuguese colonists, which were the settlers who went to Angola, married native Angolans, and then had families with them and the generations therefore that came thereafter. Under the Portuguese colonial administration, this distinction between Afro-Portuguese and European settlers was in fact a very important one. The Afro-Portuguese population was grouped together with native Africans for the purposes of certain legal rights. There was official segregation of native Africans and European settlers until the 1960s in the Portuguese administration. This manifested itself in a number of different ways over time, but it included things like access to formal employment. One of the conditions for native African and Afro-Portuguese populations to be included in formal aspects of society was an excellent mastery of the Portuguese language. However, largely without access to full education in Portuguese, and also having other languages as their native languages, Portuguese itself was kept largely separate from the native African population for a very long time. The use of Portuguese as the widespread lingua franca in the entire country of Angola would not come until after its independence from Portugal. With education being made more widely available after the 1960s, more and more people were being taught in Portuguese. As well, the cities of Angola were growing quite rapidly, and this meant a large convergence of many different linguistic groups. Because Portuguese was common to the entire country instead of just a specific region, it was selected as the main language for the country in use in administration and education. This is how Portuguese came to be the official language of Angola after independence. And independence was spearheaded by a mostly urban population who was already starting to become Portuguese speaking. If we go back to the urban-rural divide in Angola, we can see that it is in fact one of the most important factors in the status of Portuguese in the country. Portuguese has always had a significantly more consolidated status in cities in Angola. This is because of the convergence of a large number of different groups, as well as the colonial administration's preference for the use of Portuguese. What this means is that over time, under the colonial administration, wealthier native Africans in the cities, as well as the European settlers and other populations resident in the cities, would pick up Portuguese and use Portuguese in a nativized way. These populations historically over time and to this day tend to have a more normative dominance of the Portuguese language and speak a Portuguese that is closer to the European pattern of speech. But historically, rural populations were mostly excluded from the Portuguese-speaking sphere. What this means is that rural populations for a very long time had very little use for the Portuguese language. They weren't in nearly as much contact with other linguistic groups, and if they were in contact with other linguistic groups, they would usually be using native African languages to that effect. As a result, even to this day, rural populations are significantly more likely to be second language speakers of Portuguese. So Angola is marked by what is known as Diglossia, where one linguistic variety has a prestige status, in this case Portuguese, and other linguistic varieties are used commonly by the population without having that prestige status, in this case the native African languages. And the fact that such a wide swathe of the Angolan population adopted Portuguese as a second language to then go on to be the language at home means that the Portuguese that they speak is inherently going to have influences from their native languages. As we know, especially adult learners of second languages will always exhibit some level of influence and interference from their native language in their secondary languages. This gives Angolan Portuguese its own unique characteristics, especially by those who have it as a second language in Angola. We will get into some of those characteristics in just a bit. But first, let's talk a little bit about Angolan Portuguese as a variant of the Portuguese language. We have two formalized standard variants of the Portuguese language in the world today. Those are European Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese, which have specific academies legally dedicated to the regulation of the normative standards of those varieties of Portuguese. Now, Angolan Portuguese has not yet formalized into its own standard of Portuguese. However, formal bodies of standardization are not the end-all be-all of linguistic variety. So when we talk about Angolan Portuguese, we can talk about a variety of Portuguese that is emerging but not yet formally consolidated. And indeed, because the emergence of Angolan Portuguese is largely concentrated on the last 60 years, we can really talk about a variety of Portuguese that is in transition due to a very large percentage of second language speakers. The fact that these second language speakers have then gone on to shift to using Portuguese as their home language is very significant because it has implications on the Portuguese that will be used by future generations coming after them who have Portuguese therefore as a native language. The situation of diglossia in Angola is such that the Portuguese spoken by native speakers of Portuguese who have higher levels of educational attainment is much closer to the normative standard on which Angolan Portuguese is based, or the European Portuguese standard, than the speech from Angolans who have Portuguese as a second language. However, there are still significant influences from native African languages in Angola on Angolan Portuguese at all levels of society. And to this end, some level of research does exist on Angolan Portuguese. However, there is by no means the same level of research output on Angolan Portuguese as there is for Brazilian or European Portuguese. This, paired with the fact that Angolan Portuguese can be accurately described as in transition, mean that we have a smaller base from which to work in terms of describing what's going on with Angolan Portuguese. However, that doesn't mean that we don't still have a good generalized idea of what the influences on Angolan Portuguese are, and some level of a systematized understanding of what those patterns are. The situation of Portuguese in Angola is also unique for a number of other reasons. Because of its colonial heritage, Angola uses European Portuguese as its standard instead of Brazilian Portuguese. That being said, even normative Angolan Portuguese incorporates quite a lot of vocabulary from native Angolan languages, and so right from the jump, Angolan Portuguese has some differences with European Portuguese. As well, Angola is the only lusophone country at this point to not ratify and implement the Orthographic Agreement of 1990. This is something of a paradox because Angola was one of the original signatories to the 1990 Orthographic Agreement. However, due to concerns over the incorporation of an orthographic vocabulary for Angolan Portuguese, as well as other unnamed concerns by the Angolan government, there has been no real progress made to date on the implementation of the Orthographic Orthographic Agreement in Angola, which puts the country in the unique position of using European Portuguese as its normative basis, while also not following those same orthographic standards. The most recent news from the Angolan government about the implementation of the Orthographic Agreement in the country comes from 2020, when the government simply said that it was looking into ways to implement the agreement and that it would do so. However, with the pandemic and other things that have happened in the meantime, it clearly has not been a great priority for the government. Now, when we want to get into some of the unique features of Angolan Portuguese, it's important to look at where they came from and how they got into Angolan Portuguese in the first place. The native African languages of Angola are by and large languages in the Bantu language family. The Bantu language family is the largest language family in Africa and encompasses pretty much all of sub-Saharan Africa. The most significant of the Bantu languages that more people will likely be familiar with is Swahili. And as tends to happen with language families, the Bantu languages often have very similar grammatical structures and share certain grammatical features or patterns in common with one another. This is also, of course, especially true with languages that are in closer proximity to one another. Some of these influences on Angolan Portuguese are common to other regions where Portuguese is spoken. This includes places like Brazil or Mozambique, which would have acquired those characteristics through other means. However, to the extent that these varieties share these features in common, it would be because of a similar point of origin, that is, the existence of these features in Bantu language by speakers who were learning to speak Portuguese in those respective regions. The most important of these features, as I've said already in this video a few times, is the existence of native Angolan vocabulary that has come into Portuguese. Generally speaking, this means that this native vocabulary will have been adapted to Portuguese phonetic structures as well as Portuguese grammatical structures, namely they will have an inflection for gender and number the way that Portuguese words do. I did highlight this as well as some of the other features in my video about Portuguese spoken in Africa. And some of these Angolan lexical influences on Portuguese have made their way to Europe and Brazil. And when we talk about phonetic adaptation, this is another very significant aspect of influence on the Portuguese spoken in Angola as well. Adults who learn a second language are less likely to be able to pronounce that language in a natural, native sounding way. What this means is that they have a more fixed phonetic inventory or ability to produce language sounds than pre-adolescent children do. And what this means for Portuguese in Angola is that the second language speakers of Portuguese, or a large population of the country, will have a more native African influenced sound to the way they pronounce their Portuguese. One of the most significant ways that we observe this is through the opening of vowels. Vowels in Angolan Portuguese tend to be significantly more open and somewhat less reduced than in European Portuguese. Angolan speakers of Portuguese also have somewhat less lenition of their consonants than European speakers do. When I say lenition, I'm talking about the phenomenon where you might hear a European Portuguese speaker pronounce d as th. You might say fado instead of fado, for example. Angolan speakers are less likely to have that same level of lenition as European speakers are. But Angolan Portuguese did inherit the s chiado from European Portuguese. What this means is that there is allophonic variation of the sound of s depending on where it fits in a word or a phrase. When s comes before a vowel, it is pronounced as s or z, and when it comes at the end of a word or before another consonant, it is pronounced as sh. This leads to a pronunciation of words like rosto instead of hostu. But more significantly than even phonetic influences are the grammatical influences that Bantu languages have had on Angolan Portuguese. To start with, there is a very clear preference for the pronoun ang. The preference for ang extends to most verbs that might use a or other prepositions. For example, whereas a Portuguese person would say vou ao supermercado, you can expect an Angolan person to say vou no supermercado, and other sort of examples like that. This has to do with the morphological structure of Angolan languages, which tend to only have one particle that is more similar to ang for that sort of a linguistic grammatical purpose. Similarly, because of the way that pronouns and verb structures work in Angolan languages, there is a bit of an intermixing between tu and você among Angolan speakers of Portuguese, often within the same sentence. And the usage of tu and você among Angolan speakers is not strictly tied to formality either. They are simply alternating pronouns used more or less interchangeably. And for those speakers who have this phenomenon, it is also not uncommon to only have one system of conjugation for verbs. This again is due to the morphological grammatical structure of native African languages. So regardless of the person, the tendency would be to use the the third person singular of a verb. And often there are implications for pronoun placement as well. Because of this morphological structure coming from Angolan Bantu languages, there is usually a preference for proclis, or putting the pronoun before the verb, and often enclis is used in opposite situations of where we would expect it under the European Portuguese normative standard. So often for Angolan speakers, enclis, or putting the pronoun after the verb, will come after things like prepositions or adverbs or other places where it would be required to come before the verb in European Portuguese. By contrast, if no other element is present, the default for these speakers would be before the verb. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list of all of the features of Angolan Portuguese. One thing that you will often note with Angolan speakers of Portuguese is that the higher levels of education they attain, the more they assimilate their Portuguese to European Portuguese standards. This can be both grammatically as well as their intonation or phonetics. And this is also true of things like television. If you watch state news from Angola, you will hear a Portuguese that sounds fairly European. And even things like morning shows will have a very European kind of a cadence to their speech. But if you watch Angolan YouTubers or popular media from Angola, you will hear a very different Portuguese. I found some Angolan YouTube channels where you can hear Angolan speaking as normal people do there. Now, this is a very short list, and surely there are more channels out there, but just to give you a few popular examples that I was able to find, there is Baptista Miranda, which is unarguably the largest channel from Angola, made popular by going viral in Brazil. There is the sketch channel Super Pacata, which is fairly similar to Porta dos Fundos if you're familiar with that Brazilian humor channel. The Angolan YouTuber Wawera has not made a video on YouTube in quite some time, although his videos are available to watch on YouTube. However, I have chosen to include him on this list due to his video archive, as well as the fact that he is busy at work in Angola running a video production company. And lastly, we have O Imperador, which is another channel that does sketches. So to get a feel for Angolan Portuguese for yourself, you can go watch any of these channels or things like Angolan news. Another interesting thing about the news in Angola is that they do dedicate space to segments in Angolan native languages. So even on the Angolan State News YouTube channel, you can find some videos in most of the national languages of Angola. If you're interested in hearing the sounds of other languages, this might be something to look into. Now, as with any variety of Portuguese, there is plenty more that we could cover about Angolan Portuguese. However, I only have so much time in this video, and so I'm going to leave you with those recommendations. I hope you've enjoyed this overview of Angola and the Portuguese spoken in it, which has led to the emerging Angolan Portuguese variant of Portuguese. If there's anything you'd like to know about Angolan Portuguese, or you'd like me to do a follow-up video about Angolan Portuguese, let me know in the comments below, and I will certainly do my research and get to it. I would like to also do a video about Mozambique and the Portuguese spoken there, and perhaps some of the differences between Mozambican and Angolan Portuguese in the future as well. So again, if you're interested in a video like that, let me know in the comments below. So that's all I've got for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, leave me a thumbs up down below. Definitely make sure to subscribe to my channel if you're not already. I have tons of videos about the Portuguese language, which you can find directly on my channel or in the eye above, and I will see you next time. Thank you.